The financial sector has been long hailed as a sector of opportunity. In today's conversation with Dr. Simone McCurdy, Executive Manager of Capacity Building at WGEA, the Workforce Gender Equality Agency, I'm here to chat with her to really uncover what are the opportunities for financial services. And what really got me excited about our chat today is that there's such a great opportunity for all levels and all parts of financial services to be much more service-driven and purpose-driven in order to serve our customers, engage with our communities, and also make it a really attractive industry for people of all different levels and different functional areas to join the industry, stay in the industry, and really contribute by making a difference to Australians who are using banking and finance products as well as insurance products. We're going to have a chat about what the gender pay gap actually really means in financial services. What can we learn about all the different things that are being done, not just in financial services, but other sectors that have really closed the gap? And what's the potential? There's so many innovative strategies that can be adopted that doesn't necessarily take a lot of resources to do, but it's a different way of thinking in order to really future-proof our organisations so that we've got the right people in our organisations. And it's a really aspiring place for people to go and work, show up every day and do the best work that they can. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. Simone McCurdy. So nice to have you here today.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
Just to start off, I just would like to kind of get an overview of what's been happening in financial service when it comes to the gender pay gap and gender equality. Can you give us a snapshot of how the financial services sector has been performing when it comes to gender pay?
Sure. I have to say from the outset, though, that financial services as an industry is one of my favourite. When I first started doing this work 22 years ago, obviously gender pay gaps and the way in which we looked at things like work and family and some of the things that we'll talk about today were just in their infancy. So it's really good now to come back all these years after and have a bit of a deeper dive into how the sector is doing and what the industry can do to continue to improve. But in terms of data, more recently, we're looking at the publishing of the gender pay gap, we really having a look at a number of sectors. So before we talk about the metrics, we're actually looking at a number of different areas in that. So it includes insurance as well, and a range of other financial services groups. So not just, we tend to think about it in terms of banks, but at the moment you're sitting as an industry at a mean or average of 26.2 as a gender pay gap. What that means, that's the difference between total remuneration annualised. So even if people are working part-time, we annualise that figure, and that's a fairly large gender pay gap across the board. Not the biggest, but we are still seeing significant gaps. And interestingly, when we look at the workforce profile overall, the composition is sort of sitting around 50-50. I think it's 49 and 51, so 51% for women and 49% for men.
Wow, 20 years of when you first started looking at financial services till now. What are the challenges that you're still seeing that maybe existed 20 years ago that we're still seeing, particularly around the gender pay gap?
So I think, we have to sort of take a bit of a helicopter view of what generates a gender pay gap. And when we think about workforce composition, that's always one of the biggest drivers of a gender pay gap. In terms of the composition, when we reflect on what is changing and what hasn't changed, we still have this trajectory of women that do come into financial services, but they're not making it up and through the different, if we can look at it in pay quartiles, but also through just the different levels. So there's a lot of challenges clearly that not just in financial services, but also those challenges are faced in other industries as well. So we're looking at things like the ideal worker norm. Is that still alive and well in financial services? It is, and it's alive and well in most organisations in Australia. But what that is doing is actually presenting a problem, because we tend to think about a particular way of working. We tend to think about particular jobs and roles and occupations as gendered, male, female jobs, for example, and that is still happening even in this big predominantly white collar workforce that we call financial services. So I think that that's a real challenge overall. And I think, as I started to allude to before, it's a very broad church. So I would also say that the challenges are, you've got tier 1, tier 2 banking, you've got insurance, you've got brokers, you've got all sorts of different elements to what we call financial services as an industry. And I think each of those particular elements all have issues that are particular to their workforces. So, for example, in the insurance sector, having to create a surge workforce to meet the needs of high, intense weather events and things like that is something that they're having to face on a regular basis. That's a very different challenge to, say, tier 1 banking, and then even within those elements or those areas, thinking about what are the challenges within a certain area of that industry. So private banking, very different to retail banking. When we talk about women in the workforce in financial services, women are moving into financial services. They're still at the branch. They're still in the call centres. So the types of roles that they do are quite a challenge to try and remove that gendered occupational interest and approach. So we want to really have a look at the ways that we can help the sector and the industry overall to make those changes.
Why do you think the finance sector doesn't perform as well despite companies having policies in place?
I think, again, the financial services industry has a number of similarities and experiences with some of our other employer industries. So policy is only one element of what we know creates change in organisations, but also looking at the industry as a whole, there are certain things that you can do that will change things as an overall industry. So I think some of those problems are particularly thinking about how do you attract the particular cohort to an area of the business, so whether it's tier 1 banking, and then what happens to women particularly over their employment course, and then how do you actually create spaces for them in order to do that and still manage their work and family responsibilities, which is obviously something that's not just, that's just not a female thing. That's there's lots of parents out there, and we kind of still see those things as gendered. So I think trying to come to terms with what are the pockets in the industry that need the most attention, and then making sure that we bring together then those two approaches, which is having a look at the individual employer and what can be done at that employer level, but also what can be done at an industry level, and even those little industries within industries. And generally, you're going to be seeing things like, how do you create a pipeline? What do you do with that pipeline once they enter into that particular area? And then what is it that we're trying to achieve? And how do we de-gender some of those experiences right across the life course? Private banking keeps coming up for me all the time in my mind.
As a positive example?
Probably not, no.
Yeah,
I don't know. Look, and in terms of when we think about private banking and we think about what's the ethos of that, and it's very client based. So the relationship that you foster as part of that occupation, it's an occupation within an industry, what you're doing is cementing the relationships, and that is key. So what then happens is it's not a what we call a high substitution occupation. So they want to talk to Sam. They don't want to talk to the person who is sitting next to Sam or whatever, because they've developed that relationship. So when we see little pockets of industries where there's not a deal of opportunity for what we call substitution, we know that those things are going to be quite resistant to change. So we need to apply a real job design approach to that, and also broader cultural change to help clients to make that transition. So there's lots of really good information out there on how some particular occupations have done that. The thing that comes to mind would be veterinary science, for example, and pharmacy. They're occupations that have been able to introduce much greater sort of substitution amongst their workforce. The other thing that I'd say, just thinking about some of the challenges, is not actually private banking as such, it's actually the common challenges that other industries and other sectors face, is because of those relationships and the way that things are built and the way the job is structured. How much of that happens outside of the work arena? Doesn't it still happen when you're on the golf course? Does it still happen when, you're in some kind of after work social situation? So there we actually start to see some of the barriers to women, in particular in this instance, having access to those networks, having access to that kind of relationship building opportunities. And again, that's a structural issue, the way the role is, that actually enables men who aren't as perhaps tied down in that sense to caring, and it actually can create a barrier for women. Again, common across some other industries.
I would have thought that with market forces of women who have that economic power, who are on the client side, if it's relationship space, they would want to deal with people who might be of, have different personalities, different interests that they might, meet through other opportunities other than the golf course. So I guess there's market forces in terms of reflecting who the customer is.
Yep.
And then at the same time, also, if we are working longer, given that we're living longer, there is that opportunity for people who've got those relationships and networks to come into financial services and use that wisdom and the networks, relationships in order to add more to those businesses that might need more of a diverse team.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you've really touched on something there, which is about having a really good look at what are the strengths of a particular industry. And I think, you've just identified one of them, that there are opportunities, particularly if you're thinking about your client base, you're thinking about the market forces, who does the spending, those kinds of things. And in what ways can you capitalise on those strengths in order to build a pipeline and to have a really good career trajectory across the industry. Now, that brings up a really nice point about thinking critically about, we talk a lot about senior women, we talk a lot about pipelining up into boards and executives, but it's about introducing what I call slow thinking, which is to think about, okay, if that's the model that we're going to go to, and there is no wrong or right answer, but to be really aware that that is a very masculine paradigm of what a successful career looks like. And that is actually starting to become at odds with the generations as such, because we know that career mobility, we know that having a broad range of skills, getting up into the C-suite is not the end all and be all for every single person that walks into financial services. And so what we need to do is to find both the thought leadership and have the skills and the capability within the industry to think about what are we really trying to achieve, and that's going to be different for all those little pockets, those small cultures, even within one organisation.
And yeah, we do have that opportunity around the future of work in terms of how do we bring that thinking around, how do you mobilise knowledge and different teams and people with diverse backgrounds who can be part of financial services. But then it really takes leadership to acknowledge that we need that in order to be successful and to drive their businesses with a different flavour of their workforce.
To really sort of tap into what's the purpose, you know. Again, another strength I think of the industry is, you know, my education background's in psychology and social work. And so I know for a fact that finance and financial pressure is one of the biggest stresses that you can put on anyone. It has a massive impact on families, it has a massive impact on communities. So I sort of sit back and think about the financial services industry and think, my goodness, what a wonderful opportunity to really lean into that as a purpose and to think about joining these different elements together so that, you know, it's a call to action for women and men who want to come and do a purposeful career. And we see that starting to happen in some of the products that we're seeing, like in financial services. So, and also some of the capabilities and skills that we're building around domestic violence, for example, and how we're able to maybe interact with our customers in ways that seek and understand what some of their difficulties are and how can we provide products that have had a gendered lens across it and have been purpose-built for women, for example, or single parents, which are predominantly women. So we start to see this coming together of an industry that comes together over a purpose, and it becomes very purposeful in what it is trying to achieve and who it is trying to attract, and then making that call to action and making that something that is going to fit with the different businesses that you're dealing with.
And that also excites me to think that financial services could be a really purpose-driven industry. It's got that potential, but it's actually getting everyone to think it's not for profits, that it's not just their sole opportunity to actually make society better, but by serving people in different ways and acknowledging the differences between different customers and clients, no matter what part of the financial services industry. There's a great opportunity, but you kind of need to have the right people in the pipeline, as you say, coming into the industry so that they've got those opportunities to do the best work that they have and be connected to the work that they do and stay in the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I think you've got some of the best. When you think about the collection of experience that you have, and I guess I am now thinking about that executive on those boards, those directors, you know, these are some of the greatest minds that you have access to. I don't think that thinking about the vexed issues, they're what we call wicked problems, they're complex problems. But when you come and centre around purpose and you build that into the things that you're doing, we know that actually has a big difference on your employer value proposition, so that you're going to attract more people and a broader range of people to your organisation. Bring in that diversity of thinking. That is what generates so much change. And then actually really living the values of, you know, when I see, for example, a product, or I see something new, or I see a corporate giving program that has had a gender lens on it, and we really are all pulling together as an industry to make a difference and make an impact on the lives of women over their life course.
How do we shift the thinking in terms of getting people to understand? Because it is quite big picture thinking.
It is.
And I guess it does help advance organisations in achieving their goals on so many levels. And gender equality is one piece of the pie, but when you start to explain it the way you have in terms of showing that actually it's all tied together.
Yeah. Look, it is a real challenge, and I think all of the evidence is pointing to thinking less about what you do. And that's why our strategy is always around thinking about when we don't want to stuff more information into people. I mean, gender equality has been a challenge for a very long while. Certainly if we think about the last 25 years, the tools and the levers that we would pull in order to make an impact haven't changed that much. If you have a look at our gender equality indicators, they have been fairly stable. They're the things that both reflect the gender equality experience in an organisation or in an industry, but they also reinforce it. So it's both a lever for change, but also a mirror to see how well you're tracking. So that hasn't actually changed, certainly in the 22 years that I've been doing this. The way that what has changed is the thinking, and that thinking certainly for us is about thinking about creating change through what we call a coalition of influence. And that is about understanding that it's not just one person's role, one level of the business, one part of the industry that is responsible for really taking action on gender equality and getting the momentum. The idea is to actually identify a coalition of influence within your organisation and really focus less on, I say, counting women and more on making women count and thinking about the outcome. So what is the experience of a given employee within that particular business? So we start sort of thinking about it in those terms and think, okay, what actually goes on? Let's take a step back and think about what goes on in organisations. You've got a board and an executive. They're signing off on strategies. They're signing off on a whole range of things. And when we go to the website, for example, and we see this beautiful diversity and inclusion plan on there, that it does include women, how are those two things coming together? Does that board, does that executive have the language and the literacy to be able to have a contest of ideas on whether or not this particular strategy is going to be have the desired impact and help us to get towards what we're saying we will do? When we've sat down and talked to a lot of boards and C-suites, they've gone, no, not really. And, you know, again, thinking intelligently about it, why would they? When we think about MBA programs, when we think about accounting, economics degrees, those kinds of things, which really are the pipeline for that decision-making governance level, gender equality and diversity at best is an elective. Profit and loss is not, macroeconomics not. So there's some mainstream knowledge that the leaders of this particular industry have in those kinds of things and have not had the opportunity, I think, to think in those terms. And so it's like, the light, you can't unring a bell once you sort of start to see that. So your corporate giving programs, for example, your products, your services, when you apply the gender lens and we help them to understand what are some of the potentially gendered outcomes, that is a really powerful thing rather than seeing it as something sitting outside the boardroom. And we started to see that with ESG and things like that. So there's a way to tap into that with that literacy. The other part would be thinking about not just making it diversity, inclusion and HR's job, but I do think the deciding factor in all of this is getting down to that line manager level, because when we think about what is it that is creating a gendered experience on a day-to-day level, it is the line managers that create your employee experience, whether it be through recruiting, whether it be through performance, performance reviews, your remuneration, your training, your development, all of that comes up to a line manager. And if they're not able themselves to articulate and understand what a gender-attuned leadership is and how to provide a gender equal outcome or experience across that, how can we expect them to deliver that? So it's sort of this holistic approach of looking at this coalition of influence and ensuring that you're not just knowing better, we stuff a lot more information at people. It's actually helping them to do better. So the practice, what actually happens at that action level, we're finding that gets a lot more long-term traction, and that is absolutely the way going together to actually create that transformation. So it's not just one part of the organisation's problem. Everyone's pulling in the same direction.
I love that idea that a line manager can really play a big influence in terms of creating this change and closing the gender pay gap. Have you seen some really effective programs around enabling the line managers to have that, more forward way of thinking and behaving in the workplace?
In terms of mainstream rolling out these kinds of programs, that is yet to be undertaken. But what I can say is that there are some things that we know have actually created and generated within an individual organisation, some innovation and some change. So I can certainly talk to some of those. Yeah. Again, one of the things that we think about is, say, parental leave. And we know that that's a strong lever, and there's a lot of information out there on when we start to provide that to men. What we're actually doing is it's not actually giving parental leave to men in the organisation that makes the difference. What it is it starts to break down this gendered norm of women care, men work. Men are the breadwinners, women work part-time, etc., etc. So it starts what we call the ideal worker norm breaks down. What we've sort of found, and some organisations have done this, where actually when we go and read the research, men say that they feel quite cut out of that. They don't have the opportunity. They feel it's the woman's role. They own the leave. They'll get a look in. They're this secondary carer. When they change the policy, but also the practice that says, all right, everyone's taking primary carer leave in this organisation. And if you don't want to do that, you have to opt out. So it flips the script, and then they have to have a conversation with their manager. Now, their manager has been to some really good training that says working and parenting, particularly for first-time parents, it's like a bomb. But we tend to think of that being something that happens to women. But we don't realise that men also go through a transition because they've now got two bosses. They've got a child that they themselves want to see. They want to get home to support their wife, but often their own boss hasn't made any changes at all to the way that they work when they sit down and have a conversation about that. So they're not just talking about parental leave, but what happens when you step back into the workforce after that leave, that changes. That's a very different conversation, and it actually hasn't cost a cent.
I was just in Iceland doing some gender equality research, and the last 50 years they've done a really great job of being number one when it comes to closing the gender pay gap, also the gender pension gap. And so they've got a lot of evidence from when they start to introduce paid parental leave for all genders from more than 20 years ago. Like, all the evidence suggests that the families have better relationships, like the dads will have a better relationship with their children, particularly when they go through that teenage years, if they were involved with taking time off work and also then being a primary carer at one point when the child was really young. And also marriages in heteronormative relationships are a lot better because there's not so much simmering resentment from the person who may have taken more time off and sacrificed their finances over the long term to take up caregiving responsibilities. So I have great hope that with paid parental leave in Australia, we will start to see all those sorts of benefits here as well.
Yeah, and it's an important one, because we start to think about, and it just happens to be my research, area. So we looked through the research and having a look at one of the different models, and certainly the Nordic model is, held in very, very high regard. I think one of the most important things is, though, even if the leave itself is taken out of it, because there's a lot of focus on cost, there's a lot of focus on how many weeks is optimal, etc., etc. But when you actually break it down and go, even just that simple thing of putting in place a new practice or policy that hasn't cost a cent, nothing's changed in the parental leave, but the way in which we approach it still emulates that Nordic model, because the Nordic model says we expect you to take leave. It is an expectation that you will take leave. Yes, they do it in a particular way. They're a social democracy. We're not. There's all those kinds of different things. But the idea is to take the essence of what is good and see how you can apply it in your context. And that's the same for sectors, that's the same for industries, that's the same for organisations, to actually think about what is the essence of that. And the essence of that is saying it's okay for you to take parental leave or to try and manage work and care. It's not just a female, or it's not just, the mums that need to do that. It's the same as, we can apply that same rule to we talk about all roles flex, for example. Really innovative, but what does that actually mean? How many senior women are job sharing at the moment, like at executive levels? How many CEOs job share? So we can look at that in a particular way and go, it just seems really complicated. I don't know how to do it. I don't want, women working part-time, for example. But then if you flip the script, we're talking to executives saying, you get 2 lots of diversity in one role. You get 2 lots of thinking. You get a contest of ideas amongst the partners. You have this change to the ideal worker norm, that leading doesn't look like a gender anymore, and it doesn't even look like a full-time role anymore. It's breaking those down, and it can have a really powerful effect. And I know for a fact that financial services as an industry was the first to bring out so many of these great ideas and innovations, and there's no reason why it should stagnate. They can get in front of the curve now and think about these things more innovatively and be brave.
If you think of all the different career stages that someone can have in financial services, there are going to be phases in our lives when we will want to have that flexibility to dial down maybe some of the work side of things because of care responsibilities, or wanting to further study or take up more time to focus on health and well-being. There'll be seasons of our lives when we do want to do job sharing, but still do really meaningful, valuable work where we're earning the highest amounts that we can from a salary point of view. And so that's a really positive way of thinking about, why you would offer job sharing, for example, to everyone in the workplace, if they wanted it at a certain point in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And, even thinking about what are the ways in which you can think more innovatively about transition to retirement. I mean, the businesses that I've worked in, we used to call them sages. Who are our sages? So when we think about, say, a knowledge transition program, and we've got the sages that are actually retiring, often they'll want to probably start to slow down. Why aren't we pairing those up with a return to work, a woman who needs a bit of profit and loss exposure? And now we've got this perfect solution. So it's really starting to think outside the box and go back to purpose, and to think about, what is it that we're trying to achieve? Think less, the numbers are important, but the gender pay gap is a proxy measure for a whole range of things, of experiences, of structures, of processes, and it will take a long-term commitment to reduce it. However, when we think about changing the nature of that experience and thinking purposefully about that, there are many examples of this industry that has done that previously. I mean, who would have thought of having a product specifically for, students, reducing your fees, things like being attuned to single parent incomes and helping, lower the fees on banking and things like that. Innovations that are responding to the environment in which you're operating in. And so we know that they can apply that then to their own workforces. And if they don't, I can tell you there are a lot of other organisations and sectors out there that are really trying to get in front of the curve. Construction's one of them. I was just this morning at a round table thinking about how can they pipeline more women to their industry, and how do they actually stop poaching from one another, because that's exactly what happens, is because you haven't created a pipeline. within the sector or the industry, you're actually poaching from one another. So you're just moving women around as opposed to building a real pipeline with women. And of course, those things have to be done at the very entry sort of level, even high school. But also, how do we look at the cross-skilling and look at other organisations and industries that we can bring people into the financial sector? There's no reason why people can't change careers, and they do, and they will want to. So financial services is primed for it because there's so many different roles.
Yeah, you could stay in the sector and move into so many different functions and keep on learning in terms of, well, what are the future technologies that will continue to evolve. And yeah, it's such a great opportunity to think about having those transferable skills that enable you to do really interesting, impactful work, be valued for your skills. So from an individual point of view, there's a lot in it in terms of what you can gain, but also from an employee point of view, just the ways to really rethink how do we employ people, keep them competitive against not just other organisations doing the same sort of work, but actually other industries. That's a real threat if other industries are starting to innovate on how they close the gender pay gap.
Absolutely. And when you think about, ESG, here's a great example, again, because the sustainability movement was really embraced by the insurance and financial services sector very early on. When you think about what is that word sustainable, what is that about? It's about thinking about your resources in a way that is not exploitive. It's thinking about future. It's future thinking. It's thinking about things in multiple ways. So, thinking of the different stakeholders involved, the community, the shareholders. Profit's not a dirty word when you're doing it in a purposeful way that is sustainable and that leaves everybody in a much better situation than what they were when they entered into the industry or the organisation. So, it is that kind of commitment to having a holistic, purpose-built workforce that is actually going to be the key to turning this around, because we know that women and men, I don't think it's necessarily that gendered, but we know that there are times in women's lives where they are looking for a change, where they are looking for something new to do, where they're wanting to retrain, those kinds of things. And I think one of the biggest missed opportunities, and this is something that we're really looking forward to working with our employers on, is, in publishing the gender pay gap, it really was about a catalyst for a conversation. It wasn't about exposure, because that alone is not going to be enough. The last thing we want to do is not have women enter into an organisation, because then everything just stays the same. Then they just stay male dominated. Women will sit here at the top. Nothing will change. So when we talk about publishing the gender pay gaps in our employer statements, what we're putting out there publicly isn't an apology for having a gender pay gap. What it is, it's about saying, this is the line in the sand today because it's a moment in time metric. It's taken at a particular time. This is what we've identified through a strong gender pay gap analysis, which I think every organisation must do, understand what's driving that gender pay gap, and then write about it to your potential employees, to your current employees, in a way that says, we understand what's going on. We've decided we're going to focus on this, this and this. It's not scattergun approach, but we're going to take action on this. And I want this to be a call to action. I want you, if you're interested in this, to come and join us to make the change. That's a very different thing to saying the gender pay gap doesn't exist, it's calculated wrong, the only reason we've got this is because of a merger and acquisition and blah, 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 blah. Because that's not what's going to attract, and particularly the generations are changing. We know that the generations of workers that are coming through are purpose-driven. So they're going to respond to that call to action. So there's this wealth of opportunity to create a new way of being and to really be purpose-driven, created just from publishing the gender pay gap. It's not about naming and shaming. It's an opportunity.
If we can talk about that cohort of people who are coming through financial services and are early in their careers. What are your thoughts in terms of what they can do in terms of progressing gender equity in their organisations?
I think being informed, and they probably tend to be quite informed. A lot of the younger generations. I think we're even into Z. Z. I can only think in terms of X, Y. That was sort of my sort of era. But when we think about what it is that they're going to experience, they're going to experience more career than what previous generations were, and they're going to be exposed to a much greater range of industries. So there's the nature of the jobs will be different to what we had experienced. We see this with AI and those kinds of things. What I would say is getting informed about what it is that gender equality means to them. So I think the very first thing is having a really good sense of what gender equality looks like, what a gender equal employment experience looks like to them, being really clear about that. Having a look on the places like the WGEA website, their Data Explorer, which can tell you a lot about the organisation. So do your research, ask questions when you're in an interview, ask about the gender pay gap. Ask about what the gendered experience is in organisations, and really make an informed choice about where you choose to work. In terms of employers that are already there, I always say the onus is not on women to make the change, but what is going to be really helpful is if you, in a way that is, again, purpose-driven, to help the organisation to make things better, and to not assume that every woman wants flexibility, every woman wants to take parental leave, all fathers want to work full time. Like, it's sort of these assumptions, and I think there's a real role for that. But I think for the generation coming through, and also to think about what you can do in terms of thinking about your career. Don't think of yourselves in gendered terms. Think about what you want your future to look like. Now, there's another thing that's great about financial services is you have a very high average remuneration. So there's a lot to be gained for women over their life course, because it's actually a very well paid industry compared to others. So if we think about nursing and those kind of traditional jobs, social work, actually financial services you can create a really good career. And you can do that in a way that is purposeful but still earn some good money. So I think, again, it's about helping potential employees to see the benefits.
You're making me really excited to see where the world goes in financial services in terms of reshaping our cultures and the way we behave, and how we will start to value different people in client-facing, relationship-based roles, and having more diversity in those sorts of roles, and going into leadership and making it a lot more purpose-driven. What are you thinking will happen in the financial services industry if we pay a lot more focus in terms of resolving the current gap that we're seeing around the gender pay gap, but then, that if we continue to take action, what do you think will happen over the next few years?
Well, I think if we think about in a 10-year horizon, because I think that's when we're talking about gender equality and sustainable gender equality, that really is the time period that we think about. My prediction is that actually I think financial services as an industry will rise again, like it did sort of when I first started, to be at the forefront of innovation in those areas, because you do have access to capital. You do have, it's not like a not-for-profit there's no way in the world that we can put in place these different sort of initiatives that might have a cost attached to them. So I think that that's a benefit. And I think the other thing that we'll see is the financial services industry really starting to embrace their purpose, because it's the only way that they're going to be able to tap into their market. And I think the younger generation, we see that even in the FinCEA membership, which is, quite broad. And so the information that a peak body such as that is able to give and to segment their own membership and to be able to really help different segments of the financial industry to be able to tap into their need. And I think that is exactly what's going to happen. I think they have a really good, strong sense of themselves. They understand the differences between the different industries, and I do think that financial services as a whole will have the opportunity to really make a massive impact. Because as I said, money and financial strain, insurance, these kinds of things really make a big, deep impact on people's quality of life. I think the intent is there. You've got a good generation that are looking for purposeful jobs. I think we just put those things together and it will renew itself and take off and lead the way.
Excellent. Well, I'm really keen to work with you to paint this vision in terms of what is that purposeful driven financial services sector. It is a really exciting time. We've got the data to show where we can create some change and really uplift certain areas where there's some work that needs to be done. But as you say, there are sectors and organisations that have done a really good job that we can learn from. So it's really highlighting some of those best case examples here in Australia and also overseas in terms of what are the tangible things that can be done from a leadership point of view as well as individuals at different stages of their careers. So I really appreciate the time that you've taken sharing so much of your knowledge and what WGEA is doing. I think there's, a lot that can be done and, really getting people to think about it differently in the way that you've talked about it is really exciting.
Fantastic. Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this so enthusiastically, can I add? And I really do encourage anyone listening to get onto the WGEA website, have a look at the Explorer, have a look at the kinds of resources that we have, because we have masterclasses available. We have a whole range of advisory services, and we really do want to stand with the employers in the financial services sector to rebuild, regroup, and move forward together. So fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.